Okay, David, welcome. You are our our ex-Brexit correspondent. At the moment, perhaps our COVID-19 correspondent from Brighton, UK. But the issue that we are going to talk about is not so much COVID-19, but Black Lives Matter. So my first question is, what is happening in the UK on this score?
Well, I think it's been a huge wake-up call in the UK, and the sense of outrage has taken the current administration completely by surprise. They've tried to marginalize the outrage and turn it into a simple matter of the culture wars, but it's very reassuring to see a huge number of people from all ethnicities, including white people, have come out in support of the Black Lives Matter movement and will not simply allow it to be marginalized and captured and recast by the administration as a simple matter of hysteria and culture wars. So I think it's quite an extraordinary movement that we're seeing.
But how big is it in the UK? Is it as big in the US, or is it different? What kind of demands are being voiced? Can you say something about that?
Well, it is very different from the United States, and I don't think you can compare the riots and the setting of buildings on fire and the things that have gone on across the United States. I think in that sense, the protests have been clearly on a smaller scale, but they have still been very, very significant. And in the UK, it's been very much focused around two things, I would say. One is our statues, the memorialization of slavery, and the sense that people who made their fortunes out of slavery, and that includes the country itself. The UK had made extraordinary amounts of money from slavery. There's been a sense that those statues should be either taken down or completely contextualized, and that exploded the previous weekend with the pulling down of the Schoo statue in Bristol, where it was thrown into the water, and has since actually been reclaimed, but it hasn't been put back in place, and that was seen as a very powerful symbolic act. I think the other thing that's been important, and I don't know, and I think to some extent that's also the case in the US, the very large number of, the disproportionate number of people from Black and ethnic minority groups that have fallen sick with COVID and died is quite shocking. To give you just some idea, basically the first 10 or 11 deaths of doctors from COVID were Black or Asian people, the first 10, before any other white doctors died. And statistically, you're 4 times more likely to die from COVID if you're from a Black or ethnic minority than if you're white. And for quite a while, that disproportionate statistic was acknowledged but not interrogated. Recently, the government has changed its position on this, and it's now trying to actively find out just why such a large proportion of Black and ethnic minority people are dying from COVID, but it was rather too late and probably too little. So I think there is a real connection between that scandal, if you like, and the other and the Black Lives Matter protests around police violence. And it isn't completely absent by any means. You're far more likely to be stopped and searched if you're from an Afro-Caribbean or Black background, and there have been a large number of deaths in police custody that have gone unpunished, and so the idea that there is no structural institutional racism in England, which is what the government here would like you to believe, is completely untrue. So there's a lot of anger, and it's completely legitimate anger. But what is reassuring, and what makes me feel that this might be an inflection point, a complete change, is the fact that there's a huge amount of support from the non-Black and ethnic minority groups, meaning the white population.
Do you have any information about other countries in relation to COVID-19? I mean, are there any indications that, for example, in the US, or for that matter in the Netherlands, the same statistics apply, that relatively more people, Black people or people from an Asian background, are likely to get COVID-19?
Well, we do know that it's the case in the United States, but the one difference is that that statistic also includes very large numbers of people from the Latino communities as well. So that is one big difference. As you know, there's a huge Latino population in the United States, and we know that they are also part of the disproportionately larger number of people who are likely to die from COVID or be infected by COVID. As for the Netherlands, where of course I used to live, it is interesting that we still, unless you've been able to locate any information, we still don't know. And I think you've been in contact with people from the Zwarte Piet campaign who also believe that that data is not available. Can you confirm that, Menno?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Virtually nothing is known about this. We were discussing that with the people from Kick Out Zwarte Piet, and they agreed that at least for the Netherlands, this might be an instance of what we would call a structural or systemic racism, because yeah, it's kind of weird that they don't even try to assess these statistics.
Yes. It is strange because gathering statistics, which include granular, detailed knowledge about various communities that are more or less likely to become victims of the pandemic, is an absolutely crucial task in combating the pandemic. Really understanding what is going on is completely vital. So given the the long and distinguished tradition in the Netherlands of rigorous scientific analysis and rational procedures, I find it quite hard to believe that this data isn't there. So could it be that the data is there but simply hasn't been released?
Of course, that's a possibility, but my supposition is a little bit different. I think that it's kind of a paradoxical situation. You know, on the one hand, we know that also in the Netherlands, or maybe even especially in the Netherlands, racism is very much alive. But the official line here has always been that there is no such thing. as racism, and we don't want to we don't want to distinguish between races. So it may be that they just don't want to even to try to find out how many Black people or people from Asian origin or from Latino origin have gotten this disease. So yeah, I call it a paradox in that sense, you know. But still, it amounts to some kind of institutional, systemic, structural racism, if you ask me.
Yeah. Well, I think it would just be good to know, wouldn't it? That's the thing, is knowledge shouldn't be suppressed. You know, I mean, if you like, the old hacker ethic of actually opposing all forms of forbidden knowledge really is the case. But I've been very struck in my conversations with a number of Dutch friends, with the exception of yourself, is there's been a general level of trust for how your government is actually managing the crisis that is very much absent from our government. In the UK, even members of the Conservative Party are growing sceptical about the way that the government, the Boris Johnson government, is actually managing things. There's a sense of he's stumbling from error to error, from mistake to mistake. And a very interesting phenomenon happened recently, which is really struck home, is that a famous footballer who's been extremely active in terms of supplying kids, raising £20 million to make sure that children are that poor children are well fed. He wrote a very balanced letter to the Times, arguing that a government policy about the withdrawal of free school meals over the summer was a very grave error. And he did it in a very, very quiet, balanced way. And he's a Black footballer.
He's Marcus Rashford.
Marcus Rashford, yeah. Rashford, yeah. Of course, footballers are infinitely more popular than any politician. And so, whilst the Labour Party had raised the same issue last week, it was only when Rashford actually wrote this letter and started tweeting about it that the government acted and in fact reversed their policy. And this really speaks to the chaos of the current administration, but also to the growing and ever more effective activism that's coming from the Black community. It's something quite profound has changed that really shifts things. Also, during the disturbances, when very extreme far right, you could say Nazi thugs came to London and started attacking the police and the protesters, the Black Lives protesters.
This happened last weekend, didn't it?
Yes. And one white, angry white man fell to the ground and was disabled. He was rescued by a group of Black protesters, and basically they saved his life. And they took him over his shoulders. There's some wonderful pictures of this. They took him over their shoulder and took him to the police, and they've become like national heroes, you know. So the Reverend Al Sharp was on television the other night congratulating them and offering to meet them. So it is quite extraordinary that it's not only the disturbances of the Black Lives Matter movement that are coming to the fore, but also a growing sense of the dignity and effectiveness of a new wave of activism that's coming from the Afro-Caribbean and Black communities, and that is being very widely respected across the political spectrum. And that really does signify that maybe, who knows, fingers crossed, something might be changing this time.
Great. Okay, maybe one other issue that we could discuss, because that's all over the papers right now as well, which is the attempt by the Boris Johnson government to merge the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of International Rescue or Assistance. Ontwikkelingshulp, we call it in the Netherlands, development aid.
Yes.
And three former prime ministers, British prime ministers, Tony Blair, David Cameron, and Gordon Brown, have spoken out against this. What is your take on this?
Yeah. Well, I think this is quite different from the previous errors, if you like, and blunders that the government have made. Not in the sense that it's in any way a good idea, this tying of government aid to developing countries to diplomacy and trying to use it as leverage, along the lines of the Chinese government, who do something quite similar, where there'll be big loans and the loans can't be repaid, and then they become, in a way, locked into a client relationship with the Chinese government. And I think the British government are learning quite a lot from that technique and are seeking to do something similar. But this isn't something which has been a surprise to anybody, and neither is it a classic Johnson-Cummings blundering exercise where they're continually on the back foot. This has been in the planning for a long time. And in fact, the head of DFID, when she was brought on, was actually told that when she took on the job that this merger was going to happen. So this is something that's been in the pipeline for a long time. Gordon Brown and Cameron and Blair all knew it was coming for a long time. And actually, one thing which is particular about the situation is that Cameron has until now not made any critical remarks about Johnson. He's always taken it as a lesson that the previous prime ministers, particularly if they're Conservative prime ministers who've lost office, do not sit in the back of the car telling the new driver how to drive. So he has, for the first time, broken his silence, not because he feels what he's going to say will have any effect, but because he simply wants to put it on record that he opposes this initiative, and he doesn't want his silence to be taken as agreement or as complicity. So that's my reading of the situation. This has been in the planning for a long time. Most people knew that this was going to happen, that there was the belief that government aid and government diplomacy, it made sense for it to converge, for all the reasons that you would expect from a cynical government like this. And we also knew that it would be opposed by previous prime ministers. And in that sense, there's nothing at all surprising about the way this has gone.
Okay. Don't you think that something else might be going on? I'm just wondering, because you say that they usually make significant blunders, just like Trump is doing. But if we look at the US, we can also see that Trump is not only blundering, he is also taking very decisive steps into a certain direction. And may it not be the case that the same applies to the UK, and that we could say in general that the tendency of these kinds of governments, populist governments or whatever you want to call them, is that they throw up an enormous amount of dust just to take our eyes off the real issues at stake, so to speak. That's my take on this.
I think there's something in what you've said, and I certainly do agree that that is Trump's technique, which is he will throw a lot of things, a lot of mud at the wall. Some of it will stick, a lot of it won't, and even when it doesn't stick, it has the effect of a kind of displacement exercise. And often there's an attempt to distract from what is going on. And there is also the fact that the introduction, the timing of when the merger of these two parts of Whitehall was announced was on the same day as the U-turn on giving school meals in the summer, the Marcus Rushford effect, if you like. And there is a degree at which that action would have functioned as a distraction. But I think the blundering of the government is also a factor as well. It isn't only the dead cat tactic of dropping a dead cat on the table, so everybody talks about the dead cat, not the really important stuff. But there have also been too many U-turns, because it never looks good for a government to make a big announcement, enact that announcement, and then be forced to retreat from it. That's never something that you do on purpose, because it's something that makes you look incompetent and weak. And we've had 3 major U-turns in the UK. I mean, for example, the government were going to open schools, all the schools, but they've been completely unable to, you know. So it isn't only the Marcus Rushford affair, it's a number of things where the government have been forced to retreat, have been forced to U-turn, and that is something which is a blundering, a set of blunders. And moreover, the actual Conservative backbenchers recognise this. There's a growing feeling that Boris Johnson is a very effective campaigner, but a very poor prime minister. And this is something which even the Conservative Party are beginning to realise. So I'm afraid to say, I do think it's more cock-up than conspiracy.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David, for this this enlightenment, I should say. And please don't talk about dead cats anymore, since my cat.
Oh, I'm sorry, Menno. Yes, well, my condolences. I remember the cat. Well, what was the cat's name again?
Streep.
Streep, yeah, well.
The grey one.
I know. Well, I do feel very sorry. And please send my best to all the other pets in the menagerie. And no doubt a new pet will come along at some point. But
yeah, we'll see about that, but I will. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Menno.